Hi guys. I had to stop and take time out from my pledge drive calls because it's Tuesday and we got to do a video. Well, hi everybody. I want to tell you about a phone call I had today with my friend James. We were talking about several different things, and so there are two different subjects we were talking about that I thought would be good subjects for videos. So I'll do today's video on one of the things we talked about, and then on the weekend I'll do a video on another thing that we talked about. So today I want to talk about, because the subject came up in our conversation about people foolishly, not foolishly, that's a bad way to say it, but people uh, mistakenly conclude that some things to be opposite of love. In other words, if somebody is acting or feeling a certain way, that's the opposite of love. That means they don't love or don't love you or something. And one of those misconceptions is anger. And where I have found people misperceive that is some people, they disagree with um, our message on the gospel of peace to the extent that we talk about that God is no longer angry, because there has been a time, there were times when God was indeed angry, and that the gospel of peace is his declaration of peace toward all men, and that he is no longer angry. And that coincides with Isaiah 54, where he says his covenant of peace is, when his covenant of peace is established, he would never be angry again. So, but the mistake here is thinking that anger is the opposite of love, because people don't want to think that God didn't love us before the cross. Which, if He didn't love us, He wouldn't have sent Jesus, like Jesus said. But anger is not the opposite of fear, biblically even, and this proved out in my own life. I discovered it in my own life as I was coming to the understanding of the gospel and grace and peace myself. Was as my doctrines of fear were going away, I was starting to actually love myself and others for the first time in a mature way, because my love was actually trapped by the doctrines of fear that I was believing. But fear, indeed, is the opposite of love, and that is biblical. Um, a simple verse comes to mind from John. John said, "Perfect love casts out all fear." Why? Because they can't exist in the same space together. They are the opposite of each other, polar opposite. So um, the other thing that I discovered, and James and I were talking about, was that I found that fear can be very subtle, to the point where you don't recognize it as being fear. You think it's something else, or it's so subtle you barely see it on the surface at all. Um, Now, fear, when it's big and it's grand and it's not subtle, is very easy to identify. And like I was saying about how my doctrines of fear, they controlled me and kept me trapped. A huge demonstration of that fear is what's going on, like, for example, in Syria and Iraq, with the terrorists there, that have been gaining so much ground and causing so much fear. The fundamentalists, the fundamentalists over there, fear is actually the root. They themselves are driven by fear. Their doctrine is nothing but fearful, and the fear within them drives them to the fear that they're causing, and it makes them very, very dangerous. But that fear is identical in any religion, that it becomes so big because the doctrine is so strict and so strong. Um, Christians aren't immune to it either. The stronger the doctrine of fear, the more violent Christians have become throughout history. You had the Inquisitions, you had the torture chambers in Europe, you had the burnings at the stake, you had the massacres in South America, you had the witch trials here. It always led to terror and death. Um, but the subtle fears aren't so easy to see. and especially if there are larger fears disguising them. And in my experience, when I started coming to the understanding of the gospel of peace, um, uh, my big doctrinal fears went away because I discovered I was believing lies. And then further on in my journey in the gospel, I ran into something one day. I was living in Germany, and um, the United States and the Soviet Union back then, they weren't getting along with each other. They were having, a spat. And Soviet and East German tanks were all pulling up to the border, and I was not more than 30 miles from the East German border. And it scared me because in my indoctrination as a child, I was taught that when Gog and Magog and all that start to fight, and I was taught Hal Lindsey and others that uh, the Armageddon would start through this thing going on between the West and the East, and between capitalism and communism and everything. And I thought, oh my God, uh, the end of the world is right around the corner. Or I was actually upset because I wasn't thinking that, but it really I was really I couldn't get it off my mind what was going on the border. And then I realized that it was a subtle fear. I didn't even realize it was fear, but it was a subtle fear based on a subtle belief and an old belief all the way back to my childhood that I was taught. But I finally recognized it for what it was. It was fear. It was based on a false belief. And I recognized it and I said, um, that's not even my fear anymore. I don't have these fears. That's not mine. That's somebody else's trash. And I literally, like, if I were driving down the road, it was like rolling down my window and throwing trash out the window. And bye-bye, gone forever. Um, it wasn't even my trash anymore. But fear can be subtle. And the one thing that James and I were talking about is this wonderful gospel of peace and grace. Once it starts literally destroying these big doctrines that emote fear, you begin to become honest with yourself. When you are fearful based on your doctrines, you have a tendency not to want to even examine yourself because you're actually afraid of what you're going to find. Um, when your fears start getting eliminated, you're not so afraid to examine what's going on with you, what's causing issues, concerns, fears, and you can face them and deal with them. That's one of the beauties of the gospel. So fear not, everybody. Jesus said it. Fear not, and have a revolutionary week.